Mom, you're too much. You always make everything about you. My daughter said it loudly, right there in the middle of my grandson's 8th birthday party, her voice cutting clean through the laughter and the clinking of paper plates. And for a moment the entire backyard seemed to freeze around us, as if even the summer air knew something had just broken. I remember the way the string lights above us swayed gently in the warm breeze, the smell of grilled burgers still hanging in the air, and how little Ethan stood a few feet away holding his unopened present, looking between us like he didn't quite understand why everyone had suddenly gone quiet. I smiled. Not the kind of smile that comes from joy, but the kind you learn after a lifetime of holding yourself together in front of others. I set down the plate I had been carrying carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the moment even further. I see, I said softly, though I wasn't sure she even heard me. Melissa was already turning away, brushing past me with that impatient energy she'd developed over the years, the same energy that always made me feel like I was somehow standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Conversations slowly resumed around us, hesitant at first, then louder, as if everyone silently agreed to pretend nothing had happened. That was always the way with family, wasn't it? The uncomfortable truths were never addressed, only buried under small talk and polite laughter. I walked toward the gift table, adjusting the ribbon on one of the boxes that had already begun to come loose, my hands steady even though something deep inside me felt like it had shifted. I had spent the entire morning preparing for this party. I'd driven 30 miles to pick up Ethan's favorite chocolate cake from that bakery he loved, the one with the thick frosting and the little sugar stars. I'd wrapped his gift twice because the first time didn't feel neat enough. I'd even brought extra decorations, just in case Melissa had forgotten something. That's what I had always done. Filled in the gaps. Made things easier. Made things smoother. Made things more. Too much, apparently. I glanced over at Melissa as she laughed with her friends, her voice light again, as if nothing of consequence had been said. For a brief moment, I wondered if she even remembered saying it at all. But I remembered. Every word. Every tone. Every glance that followed. And as I stood there, surrounded by people who had already moved on, I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. It wasn't just what she said. It was that she believed it. That I had become, in her eyes, not a mother, not a support, not even a presence to be valued, but an inconvenience. Something excessive. Something to be managed. I picked up my purse a few minutes later, long before the candles were lit, long before the presents were opened. "You're leaving already?" someone asked, their voice polite but distant. I smiled again, the same quiet smile. "I have an early morning," I replied. It wasn't a lie. Not really. Because the moment I walked to my car, closed the door, and sat in the silence with my hands resting on the steering wheel, I knew exactly what I was going to do the next day. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I simply started the engine and drove home, the road stretching out in front of me like a line that had finally been drawn. I woke up the next morning before the sun had fully risen, the house still wrapped in that quiet, early light that made everything feel slower, softer, almost untouched by the weight of the day before, and for a few minutes I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying her words in my mind, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of clarity that felt unfamiliar and strangely steady, as if something inside me had finally settled into place after years of shifting without direction. And when I got up, I moved through my routine the same way I always did, making coffee, measuring out exactly 2 scoops the way I had for decades, pouring it into the same white mug with the small crack along the rim. The one Melissa had given me years ago for Mother's Day, back when gifts still carried meaning and not obligation, and I sat at the kitchen table, wrapping my hands around the warmth, not drinking it right away, just holding it, letting the silence speak. In a way people rarely do anymore, and I realized something that felt both simple and final. Nothing about yesterday had been sudden. Nothing about it had been out of character. It had only been the first time she said it out loud. And once something is said out loud, it cannot be undone. It becomes real in a way silence never allowed it to be. And I thought about the house she lived in, the one I had helped her buy when she and Daniel said they were not ready, how I had signed documents. Without hesitation, trusting that family did not need conditions, how I had quietly covered the property taxes the first 2 years because they were tight on expenses, how I had paid for Ethan's preschool when they said tuition was higher than expected, and how every time I did something, she would smile in that polite, distant way, as if gratitude was something she had learned to perform but never truly feel, and I had accepted it because that is what mothers do. We accept less so our children can have more. But sitting there that morning, I understood that somewhere along the way, giving had turned into enabling, and helping had turned into expectation, and I had become not a person in her life, but a resource, something reliable, something always there, something that could be counted on without ever being valued. And I finished my coffee slowly, rinsed the mug, and placed it carefully back in the cabinet, aligning it with the others as if small acts of order could reflect the decision already forming in my mind. And when I walked into my bedroom, I did not hesitate. I opened the drawer where I kept my documents, the neatly organized folders labeled in my own handwriting, and I pulled out the one marked accounts, flipping through the pages with calm, deliberate movements, each number, each statement, each signature telling a story I had ignored for too long. And I sat down at my desk, picked up the phone, and scheduled an appointment with the bank for 10 o'clock that morning, my voice steady, polite, unremarkable, the same voice I had used my entire life, but this time it carried something different beneath it, something quiet and unshakable, and when I hung up, I did not second-guess myself. I did not call Melissa. I did not explain, because for the first time in a long time, I was not reacting to what someone else had said. I was responding to what I finally understood. I arrived at the bank 10 minutes early, the same way I always had for every appointment in my life, not because I was anxious, but because being early had always felt like a quiet form of respect for other people's time, for order, for structure. And as I sat in my car for a moment before going in, I watched the automatic doors slide open and closed as customers came and went, each of them carrying their own concerns, their own routines, their own assumptions about what would still be there tomorrow. And I wondered how many of them had ever stopped to question that assumption, how many believed that what they had access to today would still be available without question the next day. And then I stepped out, straightened my jacket, and walked inside with the same calm, steady pace I had carried through the rest of my life, the kind of pace that does not draw attention but never hesitates either. And when I reached the front desk, I gave my name, and the young woman behind the counter smiled politely, typing something into her computer before asking me to have a seat, her voice cheerful in a way that reminded me of how easily people move through their days when nothing has yet forced them to see things differently. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, noticing the small details around me, the soft hum of conversation, the quiet clicking of keyboards, the way sunlight filtered through the tall windows and landed across the polished floor. And when my name was finally called, I stood up without rushing and followed the man who introduced himself as Mr. Carter into a small office with glass walls that made everything feel visible and contained at the same time, and he gestured for me to sit, asking how he could help me today. And for a brief moment I looked at him, really looked at him, wondering if he would notice anything different about this conversation, if he would sense that what I was about to say was not routine, not casual, not reversible. But of course he did not, because to him, I was just another customer, another account, another set of numbers on a screen, and I appreciated that, the simplicity of it, the lack of history, the absence of expectation. And I placed my folder on the desk, opened it carefully, and said in a calm, even tone that surprised even me, I would like to close all joint accounts and transfer the remaining funds into a new account under my name only. And there was a brief pause, just long enough for him to register the scope of what I had asked, and then he nodded, professional, composed, asking a few standard questions about identification, about confirmation, about whether I was certain, and I answered each one clearly, without hesitation. Because certainty is not loud, it does not need to be, it simply exists, steady and unshaken. And as he began processing the request, Typing details into a system, explaining timelines and procedures. I listened, but not in the way I once would have. Not with concern about inconvenience or disruption, but with a quiet understanding that this was not something being done to anyone. This was something I was choosing for myself, and when he asked if I wanted to keep any of the existing arrangements in place, I shook my head gently and said no, everything should be updated accordingly, and as the final forms were printed and placed in front of me, I picked up the pen, the same deliberate motion I had used when signing so many documents over the years, and I signed my name slowly, carefully, as if writing it for the first time, not as someone's mother, not as someone's support system, but simply as myself, and when I handed the papers back, there was no dramatic feeling, no sudden rush. Just a quiet sense that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and as I stood to leave, Mr. Carter thanked me for my time, his voice polite, unaware that he had just witnessed the end of something that had taken years to build and only a few minutes to change, and I walked out into the late morning light, the air warmer now, the day fully awake, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no urgency to explain myself to anyone. When I got home, the house felt exactly the same as it had that morning, quiet, orderly, untouched, and yet there was something different about the way I moved through it, not faster, not lighter, just more certain. As if each step no longer needed to ask permission from anyone else, and I set my purse down on the small table by the door, the same place I had placed it for years, and for a moment I stood there, listening to the silence, not as something empty, but as something full, something that no longer needed to be filled by obligation or expectation, and I walked into the kitchen, rinsed my hands under warm water, dried them carefully, and began preparing a simple lunch, nothing elaborate, just a sandwich and a cup of tea. The kind of meal that does not demand attention, and as I moved through those familiar motions, I found myself thinking about all the times I had stood in that same kitchen cooking for others, adjusting recipes to suit their tastes, making sure everything was just right, not because anyone asked me to, but because I believed that was what love looked like, and perhaps it was, but love without balance has a way of becoming invisible, and invisible things are often taken for granted, and as I sat down to eat, I realized I could not remember the last time I had prepared something just for myself without considering how it might affect someone else, and that realization did not feel sad. It felt clarifying, like finally seeing a pattern that had been there all along, and after I finished, I washed the dishes immediately, not out of habit, but because I wanted the space to remain as clear as my thoughts felt in that moment, and then I walked into the living room and sat in my chair by the window, the one that caught the afternoon light just right, and I let myself think, not about what I had just done at the bank, but about everything that had led to it, the years of small accommodations, the quiet compromises, the unspoken agreements that had slowly shaped my place in my own family, and I remembered the first time Melissa had asked for help with the house, how she had sounded unsure, almost hesitant, and how I had reassured her without a second thought, telling her that family takes care of each other, and I had believed that completely. I still did, but somewhere along the way, taking care had become one-sided, and I had not noticed when that shift happened. Or perhaps I had noticed and chosen not to see it clearly, because seeing it would have required me to change something I was not ready to change, and as the afternoon stretched on, the sunlight moving slowly across the floor, I understood that today was not about punishment. It was not about proving a point. It was about restoring something that had been lost long before yesterday's words were spoken, something quiet and essential, and as I sat there, my phone remained on the table beside me, silent for most of the afternoon, until it finally lit up with a call, her name appearing on the screen, and I looked at it for a moment, not with hesitation, not with anger, just with a calm awareness that whatever came next would not be handled the way it had been before, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, before it stopped, the silence returning just as steady as before, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to break it. The second call came less than 5 minutes after the first, sharper this time, more persistent, the kind of ringing that carried urgency even before a single word was spoken, and I watched the screen light up again with Melissa's name. The letters bright against the quiet room, and I could almost picture her standing somewhere with her phone pressed tightly to her ear, her expression no longer composed, no longer casual, but edged with something she was not used to feeling, and I let it ring. Again, not out of cruelty, not to make a point, but because I understood that answering immediately would only pull me back into a rhythm I had finally stepped out of, and when the call stopped, a message followed almost instantly. The small vibration of the phone breaking the silence, just enough to remind me that the world outside this house was already shifting, and I did not rush to read it. I simply picked up my teacup, now lukewarm, and took a slow sip before setting it back down, allowing myself the space to choose when and how I would engage, something I had not given myself permission to do in a very long time, and when I finally unlocked the phone, her message was short, not carefully worded, not softened, just direct in a way that told me she had not yet adjusted to the idea that things might no longer work the way they always had. Mom, call me back. Something is wrong with the account, and I read it once, then again, noticing how the concern was framed, not as a question about me, not as a check on whether I was all right, but as a problem that needed to be fixed, something that had interrupted her day. And I set the phone down without responding, not because I did not care, but because for the first time, I was allowing her to sit with the consequences of something she had never had to consider before. And as the afternoon moved forward, the messages continued, each one a little longer, a little less controlled. My card got declined. I cannot access the transfer. Did you change something? And I read each one in the same steady way, without letting them pull me into urgency, without letting them dictate my response, and I thought about all the times I had adjusted my own plans to accommodate her needs, all the times I had answered immediately, fixed things quietly, made sure everything continued smoothly without ever asking whether it should, and I realized that this moment, this unfolding confusion on her end, was not something I needed to correct right away. It was something she needed to understand, and as the sun began to lower outside the window, casting longer shadows across the floor, the phone rang again, and this time I let it ring longer before answering, not rushing, not preparing, just picking it up when I was ready, and when I finally pressed the button and brought it to my ear, I did not speak. Immediately, I simply listened to the sound of her breathing on the other end, slightly uneven, slightly strained, before she said my name, sharper than usual, Mom, what is going on? And for a moment, I considered all the ways I might have answered that question in the past, explanations, reassurances, apologies, but instead I chose something simpler, something that required no adjustment, no softening, no performance, and I said calmly, nothing is wrong, Melissa, and there was a pause on the other end, a pause filled with the unfamiliar weight of not being immediately accommodated, and I could feel the shift beginning. Not loud, not dramatic, but real, steady, and impossible to ignore. She did not respond right away, and in that silence I could almost hear her trying to reorganize the situation into something that made sense to her, something that fit the version of reality she had always known, where problems appeared and I quietly solved them, where interruptions were temporary and everything returned to normal without requiring anything from her beyond expectation. And when she finally spoke again, her voice had shifted, less sharp, more controlled, but underneath it there was something new, something unsteady. What do you mean nothing is wrong? My card got declined at the store. I cannot access the account. The transfer did not go through. Something is clearly wrong, and I listened without interrupting, letting her list each inconvenience, as if naming them would somehow restore control, and when she finished, I did not rush to fill the silence. I simply allowed it to sit between us, the way silence had sat with me so many times before, unnoticed, unacknowledged, and then I said, calmly, evenly, the accounts have been updated, and there was another pause, shorter this time but heavier, as if the words had not landed the way she expected. Updated how? She asked, her tone tightening again. And I could hear movement on her end, the faint sound of a car door closing, footsteps, the environment around her becoming louder as her internal composure began to slip, and I chose my words carefully, not to soften them, but to make them clear. They are no longer joint accounts, and for a moment there was nothing, no immediate response, no quick correction, just the sound of her breathing, and then, "You did what?" The question came out sharper, more direct. Stripped of the casual confidence she usually carried, and I did not repeat myself. I did not elaborate. I simply let the statement stand, because it did not need explanation. It needed acknowledgement, and she let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief. "Why would you do that without telling me?" she asked, and there it was, not concern for me, not curiosity about what had changed, but frustration about the lack of notice, the disruption of a system she had assumed would remain unchanged. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking out the window as the light continued to shift across the afternoon, and I answered in the same steady tone, because it was mine to change, and the silence that followed was different this time, not just confusion, but resistance, as if she was searching for the right argument, the right angle to restore the balance she was used to. "Mom, that is not how this works. We have bills coming out of that account, the mortgage, the utilities. Everything is set up through there." And I listened again, recognizing the pattern, the assumption that systems exist independently of the people who sustain them, and I responded, not with defensiveness, not with explanation, but with something simpler: "Then you will need to update them." And the quiet that followed was longer, heavier, stretching between us in a way that could not be easily dismissed. And in that moment, I knew this was the part she had never experienced before, the part where things did not adjust back, where the answer was not immediate resolution, but a shift in responsibility. And when she spoke again, her voice was lower, more measured, but still edged with something unsettled. "You cannot just decide this on your own." And I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition of how deeply that belief had been rooted, and I said, quietly, "I already did." The words settled between us, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a weight that did not need to announce itself, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the line still open, the connection still there. But something fundamental had shifted in a way that could not be smoothed over with the usual reassurances, and I could hear her breathing again, slower now, more controlled, as if she was trying to recalibrate, trying to find a version of this conversation where she could still direct the outcome. "This affects more than just you," she said finally, her tone steadier, but no less firm. "There are responsibilities, there are things we agreed on," and I listened, recognizing the language, the framing, the subtle way responsibility had always been positioned as something shared when it required my support, but rarely acknowledged when it required her accountability. And I answered without raising my voice, without changing my pace. "The responsibilities have not changed, Melissa, only who is managing them." And there was a slight pause before she responded, shorter this time, sharper. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." And I allowed a small breath to pass before replying. Not because I needed time to think, but because I understood the importance of not rushing to fill silence anymore. "No," I said quietly, "I am making it clear," and the distinction hung there, subtle but undeniable, and I could almost feel her resistance pressing against it, searching for a way around it. "So what, you are just going to cut me off like this?" she asked, and there was something different in her voice now, not just frustration, but a trace of disbelief. As if the idea itself did not fit into the version of me she had always known, and I considered her words carefully, not to correct them, but to respond truthfully. "I have not cut you off," I said. "I have stepped back, and the difference mattered." Even if she did not yet see it, and there was a longer silence this time, one that stretched beyond discomfort into something closer to realization, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but still carrying that edge of resistance. "You could have talked to me first." And I looked out the window again, watching as the last of the afternoon light began to fade into early evening, and I thought about how many conversations I had initiated over the years, how many times I had tried to address things gently, indirectly, hoping to preserve harmony, and how those conversations had been received, acknowledged in the moment, then quietly dismissed in practice, and I answered simply, "I have talked to you." Many times, and I did not list examples, I did not explain further, because I knew that recognition could not be forced. It had to come on its own, and the silence that followed was no longer just resistance, it was something heavier. Something closer to being confronted with a truth that had been easy to ignore until it could no longer be avoided. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was different, not softer exactly, but less certain. "So what happens now?" she asked, and I let the question sit for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because for the first time, it was not mine alone to provide, and when I responded, my voice remained steady, unchanged. "Now you take care of what is yours," and I did not add anything more. Because sometimes the clearest answers are the ones that leave no space for misinterpretation, and as the line stayed open for a few seconds longer before she ended the call, I set the phone down gently, the quiet of the room returning without interruption, and I realized that for the first time in a very long time, I was not waiting for the next reaction. I was simply present in the decision I had already made. The house grew quieter as the evening settled in, not in a heavy way, but in a steady, uninterrupted rhythm that felt different from the silence I had known before, and I moved through it without distraction, turning on a small lamp near the window. The soft glow filling the room just enough to make everything visible without demanding attention, and I sat down again in the same chair, my hands resting lightly in my lap, not waiting, not anticipating, simply existing in a space that no longer felt defined by someone else's needs. And for a while, nothing happened, no calls, no messages, just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a car passing by outside. And I let that stillness remain, not reaching for my phone, not checking the time, because I understood that whatever came next would come on its own, without my involvement. And when the phone finally lit up again, it was not a call this time, but a message, longer than the ones before, the kind that takes a few moments to read, and I picked it up slowly, unlocking the screen with the same deliberate motion I had used all day, and as I read her words, I noticed the change immediately, not in the content alone, but in the tone. The edges of certainty had softened, replaced by something less controlled. "Mom, I do not understand why you are doing this. We have bills due this week. I tried to pay the mortgage, and it did not go through. Daniel is asking questions. I do not know what to tell him." And I read it again, not searching for meaning, but observing what was no longer there. The assumption that everything would be handled, the expectation that I would step in without being asked, and I set the phone down beside me, letting the message sit without immediate response. Because understanding does not come from being told, it comes from experiencing, and as the minutes passed, another message appeared, shorter this time, less structured. "Please call me," and I looked at the screen for a moment, before turning it face down on the table, not to ignore her, but to allow space for something that had never been given space before, and I thought about the systems that had been built over the years, the automatic payments, the shared access, the quiet flow of resources that had made everything seem effortless, and how easily those systems had masked the imbalance beneath them, and now that they were no longer in place, the absence was not just noticeable, it was undeniable, and I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water, the simple act grounding in a way that felt intentional, and as I leaned against the counter, I realized that this moment, this discomfort on her end, was not something I needed to fix. It was something that needed to exist, to be felt fully, without interruption, without immediate resolution, because without that, nothing would truly change. And when I returned to the living room, the phone remained where I had left it, silent again. And I sat down once more, the room dim, the evening deepening outside the window, and for the first time, I did not feel the pull to restore what had been disrupted. I felt the quiet strength of letting it remain undone. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet morning that does not demand attention but simply unfolds, and I woke at the same time as always, the soft light coming through the curtains, the house still and undisturbed. And for a moment I lay there listening, not for anything specific, just noticing the absence of tension that had once followed me from one day into the next, and when I got up, I moved through my routine with the same steady pace, making coffee, opening the window slightly to let in the cool air, the faint sound of birds outside replacing the noise that had once filled my thoughts, and I sat down at the kitchen table, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I was preparing for something, I simply was, and as I took a slow sip, my phone lit up again, her name appearing on the screen, but this time I did not feel the same pull to respond immediately, not because I was avoiding her, but because I no longer felt responsible for managing the moment, and I let it ring once before answering, bringing the phone to my ear without rushing, without expectation, and when she spoke, her voice was different, not sharp, not demanding, but quieter, less certain. "Mom," she said, and there was a pause, longer than usual, as if she was searching for the right words and finding that they did not come as easily as before. "I went to the bank this morning," she continued, her tone careful now, measured in a way that suggested she was stepping into unfamiliar ground. They explained everything, and I listened without interrupting, allowing her to continue at her own pace, because for the first time, she was not speaking to direct me, she was speaking to understand. And she let out a small breath before saying, "I did not realize how much of it was yours," and the sentence lingered there, incomplete but clear enough, and I looked out the window as the sunlight spread across the yard, steady and quiet, and I answered in the same calm tone I had carried through all of this. It always was, and there was another pause, but this one felt different, not resistant, not defensive, but reflective, as if she was finally seeing something that had been there all along but never fully acknowledged, and when she spoke again, her voice softened just slightly. "I think I have been assuming things," and I did not correct her, did not expand on it. Because recognition does not need to be guided once it begins, and she continued, "Daniel and I are going to figure out the payments. We are setting everything up under our names," and I nodded to myself, even though she could not see it. Understanding that this was not about separation, it was about responsibility, and when she added, "I just wanted to let you know," I heard something new in her voice, something that had not been there before. Not gratitude exactly, not apology, but awareness, and that was enough, and I responded simply, "That sounds right," and the conversation did not stretch beyond that. There was no need to revisit the past, no need to explain what had already been understood, and when the call ended, I set the phone down beside me, the quiet of the room settling back in without interruption, and I finished my coffee slowly, the warmth still there, steady and unchanged, and as I sat there, I realized that nothing had been taken away from me, nothing had been lost. Something had simply been returned to its proper place, and for the first time, I was no longer too much, I was exactly enough, and that was not something that needed to be said out loud to be true.